I thought we could start by talking about what open source looks like for each of our organizations or institutions, just because we all have different practices. I'll start with Varro. We are a startup biotech organization. We operate in hardware, software, and microbiology. And we are using open source to help illuminate adoption around this technology. And we're very passionate about the detection of pathogens for the protection of all humans.
And so the microphone is working. Okay, good. I hope I will try not to break it. I'm not. I wasn't looking at you for that, Frank. Okay, so yeah, Wolfgang Gehring is my name. I'm from Mercedes-Benz Tech Innovation. We are a 100% subsidiary of the big mothership, Mercedes-Benz, and you probably know what we do. Okay, we make cars and vans and vehicles. And so we'll talk about this open source adoption later on, right? This was just for brief introductions, right?
Yes. Well, if you could explain a little bit about open source in Mercedes-Benz and what it's doing for Mercedes-Benz as a practice.
Okay, so I can say a lot about that, I suppose. So let me start. So going back about 2016, 17, we weren't using open source in our software development. We would just really develop all the code ourselves. And that, from today's point of view, is almost unthinkable, right? No, it is unthinkable completely. It's just not possible anymore. Using open source in software development is like the air you breathe. I mean, you need it. That's it. That's all there is to it. And so the voices grew louder and louder so it started sort of as a grassroots movement. And so I was one of the voices, but many other colleagues as well. And they said, hey, we need to use open source in our software development. And we also need to engage in inner source practices, because we weren't doing that either. So we weren't even sharing code within the company. So one department would develop code and the other company couldn't use it. It's like, no, sorry, we weren't legally allowed to share code within the company, which is really weird, isn't it? And so there's like, okay, we have to do something about that. But so we weren't equipped yet in 2016 to do that. We didn't have technology. I mean, the sharing technology, you know, because somebody was, so one team was using Bitbucket, Stash, the other team was using GitLab and GitHub and Team Foundation Server and whatnot. You know, everything was there, and that makes sharing difficult. So one was a technical prerequisite, two was the legal prerequisite that I just mentioned, and three was the mindset also. It was like, no, that's how we've always done it, right? And so that clearly that needed to change. And so from the grassroots movement, the voices grew louder, and also we were able to reach our top management, you know, the CIO and the CEO of Mercedes-Benz, and they listened to us, fortunately, and they understood, and they said, okay, look, we need to do something about that. So from that point, that was sort of the starting point to get open source and inner source into the official IT strategy of the company, and then we went from there. But we'll dive into that.
Great start.
And move on to.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Lieggi. I'm from University of California in Santa Cruz. We are one of the smaller UCs, but we are proud to say that we were the first OSPO at the University of California. We were also one of the open source has been a very kind of key part of what has put UCSC on the map. So if anybody Googles UC Santa Cruz, typically you either get the human genome or you get the banana slug, which is our mascot. So for those of you from the US, you know the joke. For those of you not, it's a running joke that we have the best mascots in the US for our university. But the other important thing is that we and this was an early start for open source. This was late 90s. Early 2000s, when the human genome was open source by a couple of our researchers, which allowed it to be used more widely and had way more impact than if it had been put under patent, which was the threat from another research group at that time. So, which was probably the best thing that could happen to open source at UCSC, because we got way more, we showed way more impact, where there was way more prestige that came out of that one action of open sourcing that than we could have ever gotten from a patent or anything else. And I think that that made it easier for us to kind of have an inroad with our Office of Research and all of the leadership with regards to, you know, when we talk about open source, they see that as a positive. And you don't always see that even within the UC system. That is, so our other sister campuses can have a little bit more of a struggle with that. Where I work is the Center for Research in Open Source Software. That's where kind of the OSPO got its start. And we came about because of the Ceph storage system, which is an open source storage system that was created by a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz in the around 2010-ish time period. And he was able to then, after graduation, create a very profitable, very lucrative project out of that is now part of the Linux Foundation. So again, you know, our Office of Research looked at that, went like, that would probably not have been given us as much funding and prestige if we had, you know, gone down a more proprietary route. So we got a good, nice little chunk of donation from that particular alumni, which allowed us to create Cross. And from there, we did a lot of collaboration with industry. We had industry members and industry partners that we worked with to kind of try and recreate that. We never did get another Ceph. That is a pretty unique kind of unicorn thing, but were able to use open source and open collaboration with industry and other partners in ways, I think, that increased the impact of the work that was being done by Santa Cruz, which, like I said, is a relatively small player, even in the UC system. So I think that showed, that has continued to show how open source can be used in an academic setting, especially in the collaborative efforts with industry. That's me.
So I'm the parent to a 13-year-old boy who my evening job is to help him with his maths. So I reduce everything in life down to Venn diagrams at the moment, because that's what I'm studying and getting ready for the junior cert again. So if I was to look at companies, there are, you know, on one side of the diagram, there are the companies that made a very quick pivot to open source engagement because it was so fundamental to their business. It became very clear to their strategies that they needed to engage in open source. And then there's the 99% on the other side of the Venn diagram, which I think is like you guys and us, where, hey, we use open source and open source is important to what we do. But the engagement part, why would we do that? And if we want to do it, how would we do it? And, you know, as I said in the keynote, like, we've 150 years of doing things largely our own way. Internally, but open source is still and has grown in its importance to us. And as you take your products and start to make them cloud ready and cloud native and start to, you know, ride all the new technology trends, AI, etc., you realize, and it becomes part of our technical strategies to actually engage in open source. And to engage in it well, you have to educate constantly within companies as to what you're doing, what expectations should be, what they shouldn't be. And that's how we kind of came about. That's what my job is, really, to work with the Ericsson business units, to have command of the facts about what should be possible with open source and what shouldn't be possible with open source. And yeah, to essentially how to get the best outcomes for our business. So that's what we do.
Fantastic. So I know for my organization, we're very small. We can't afford all the engineers in the world. And so having an open source practice, and we've indeed also used InnerSource to kind of drive collaborative efforts and teach people how to work in the open, being in the biotech space. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's not always the most open field. And so helping to drive that kind of openness has been really critical for our advancement and our iteration on all of our technology. And so I'm happy you brought up InnerSource. When you think about open source as a practice, what are some of the fundamentals that really drove the collaboration within your organization or accelerated it for you, for each of you? Stephanie, would you like to go?
Yeah, I think for us it was that ability to combine working with a industry or other external partners in a way that also respected kind of academic freedom or an academic, like the need for researchers to do their research versus follow some sort of like path that was led by a specific sponsor. So we create basically a safe space that researchers from industry and academia can collaborate in ways I think that are beneficial to both sides. So beneficial to the research that the academic wants to do, be it a PhD student or a postdoc or you know a researcher faculty member. As well, but that also has real world impact. And I think that is what I've seen is the most useful of some of the ways that we've set things up. There's also like a standardization aspect that I think universities in particular are really useful for in this space, where industry sectors can come together and work together specifically on a standard of some sort. And academic and open source space is a good place to do that, a safe space to do that without being seen as like colluding or something like that. So that's another area that we've definitely had some work on, that we've worked with industry partners, and they find it very useful. And I think even just internally from, you know, there's a lot of silos, and that's surprising. You guys probably don't know this, but there's a lot of silos in academic institutions. And this is a great way for us to kind of like, oh, I work now with the people in the physics department. Like I didn't think, as part of the computer science department, I had not necessarily thought to work with them before, you know, and there's a lot of that we've seen through working, like focusing more on open and working in open collaborations and open source.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick up your silos thing, because yeah, we live that too. One example that I can give is we actually have two groups within Ericsson, two products that would normally be, how do I put this diplomatically, maybe at loggerheads, one treating other as a customer, et cetera, et cetera. But they're actually collaborating together through an open source project. So rather than the traditional kind of throwing one thing over the fence or trying to manage all that, they work together. If there's a problem, either side can go and fix it in the open source. It's like there's an open ecosystem there. If you have a problem, go fix it there. And the brilliant thing about open source is it has a set of rules and conventions already laid out. So you can take advantage of that to do inner source, essentially, but through the open source mechanism. And that's actually something that we're doing at the moment, and we're learning through, and it works really well. And it reduces friction within companies and within silos.
So in the automotive industry, we have no silos. Okay, I suppose you're not buying into that. All right, so we have the silos, obviously. Inner source is one way of trying to break the silos, and it's working to a degree, but you know, so in full honesty, inner source is not yet at the place where we want it to be. But you know, also in a big company, things move kind of slow, so we're working on that still. But we do see some good results already. But you know, there's more room for improvements. But now. The question was about open source, right? So in the automotive industry, typically you have car IT and the business IT, which is completely separate. It doesn't have to be completely separate, but it's somewhat separate. And it makes sense, you know, because business IT is mainly about internal systems. The car IT is about IT in the vehicle, and you need to be a lot more careful what comes into the car, because you know, once it's out there, right? So in the business IT, the adoption of open source went faster, I would say, because just we didn't have as many precautions. And for software engineers, it's like open source, of course, hello, you can't develop software without it anymore. In Carty, they're like, okay, good, but how do we approach this to make it very safe and secure? And you mentioned some of this morning already. So what really now is stepping up the game and improving the collaboration in open source is the software-defined vehicle working group, which is a working group that's under the roof of the Eclipse Foundation. And that's where a lot of automotive and non-automotive companies come together to work on, well, things that concern the vehicle. So software-defined vehicle. You know, back in the day, we used to bend steel sheets at Mercedes in certain ways, and in the end, a car came out, right? We still do that, but now the IT, obviously, inside the car is a lot more important than 30 years ago, right? And so a lot of the vehicle is defined by the software that's inside it. And I want to talk a bit more about the software-defined vehicle. Can I, yeah?
Please.
Okay, so this whole software-defined vehicle working group gained a lot of momentum last year. In June, there was a memorandum of understanding signed between a lot of high-profile executives from Mercedes. Our chief technology officer, Markus Schäfer from RD, he signed it, as well as similar people from BMW and Volkswagen and ZF and Bosch and ETAS and several others. A memorandum of understanding to collaborate on software stack together and create work on it together in open source. So even if you're not at the table, you can still use it, of course. But if you want, you can contribute. And this is turning out very nicely. I mean, it's not perfect yet, of course, but there are a lot of projects in that space that are now coming to fruition where it's so cool. So just an example, last year I went to the office and I saw people from other companies. There was BMW, ZF, Volkswagen, Porsche, and they're all together at the table talking about implementing a software stack together. And this would have not been possible a few years ago because, you know, there are rules like antitrust laws. And these still apply, obviously, but if you work in open source, it's open. You can collaborate openly together, and it's not a secret, not behind closed doors, anything like that, which is not legal. And so that really opened my heart. I was like, this is so cool, you know, like these are our friends or frenemies yeah. And we now work on certain things together. This is really amazing.
I mean, for an industry to acknowledge a practice like that and to all come together and drive the industry forward and with that standard, I mean, incredible automotive example. Frank, I know that Ericsson, coming out of Ireland, is a global organization, and a lot of your collaborative efforts, I assume, are going towards global projects. Could you give us an example of how the open source is kind of driving that from here, from Ireland?
I think in my keynote, you know, you're obviously compressed in time, but I had those currents of regulatory was one of those currents underneath. Geopolitical was another. So in our industry, security is absolutely massive. We provide key critical digital infrastructure for many countries. So securing our products, securing open source is a big deal to us. Some of the work that we have done in Ireland of late, when we started, we worked in a very kind of narrow set of projects, mostly in the kind of telco space. But over the previous years, we have started to widen in what we have done. And the primary kind of mechanism for that widening has been security work. So what we have been doing is we built a team, set up a team that are actually fixing CVEs, you know, critical vulnerabilities upstream. And that benefits Ericsson, benefits the industry, it benefits everybody. But it's so important to us. We have to have the ability to get fixes done and into our products. And that's one of the things we're doing out of Ireland. We have a dedicated team, a sub-team doing that. I think they've touched like 100 different CVs upstream across, I think, 40 different communities. So, and the cool thing about that is, you know, everything I say comes back to learning how to do this and how to be really good at it and effective. And the wider you go across these different communities, the more experience you gain. So as well as doing something that's really important for our business, we're also kind of looking at the macro goal of, you know, our people are getting more experience and more, you know, reputational capital is the way we put it. So just to explain, if you go to one of these communities and say, hey, I've got a fix for your problem, you might get ignored because the maintainer of that community is too busy or just doesn't know who you are and doesn't have the time to figure that out. Whereas, you know, if you've built up a kind of a reputation, if they can look at your GitHub history and say, oh, actually, this person has fixed this problem, you know, they're obviously, and maybe they're associated with something like an OpenSSF or one of the foundations and they're known there, then, you know, it becomes easier to get things done upstream. So, yeah, that's one of the things we've been driving, and it's been well received in the wider Ericsson kind of group as well. And yeah.
That's fantastic that you're having a global impact in the security realm. And, you know, working across borders is obviously a very critical component to this. I know bridging different industries is also an important component to open source. And so, Stephanie, when you think about your guys' role in driving kind of tech transfer from academia to corporations and how that has kind of empowered your community and broader, if you could speak to that a little bit about your role there.
Yeah, I think it's you know, we actually, unlike a lot of my colleagues who work in academic open source, we actually have a pretty good relationship with our tech transfer. They're not 100% like, oh, everything should be open source, but they're pretty, they understand the need for certain things, and they've seen the impact that something being open sourced and then built upon has had on the, you know, the proliferation of the research that, or the transfer of the research and kind of the movement of innovation. So I think that there's definitely an understanding there. I also think that kind of in the similar idea to what you were saying about how it works with inner source in this discussion of like, or removing the stovepipes and working in this working group as well, where it's not, I guess, inner source is more the idea of working between the different people who should be, who are normally competitors. I think it's that as well, is that what is being seen is not just a tech transfer from maybe one researcher or one research to a specific company, but to a sector in general. And that impact that has, I think, has been, and the level of transparency that you have to be able to really make that impact really requires an open environment, an open source environment. And I think that is one of the things we see from an academic perspective as well, is because I don't necessarily want to just work with just one industry. And like what Cross did was it worked with a sector. It was multiple partners working on this, like a similar or on a specific, a specific technology or a specific project, and that would have much more of an impact or a larger scale and more easy to kind of build off of. So it's not like somebody worked on one thing, everyone's like, oh, this is great, and then forgot about it. It's more that, oh, we're going to keep it transparent, keep it not just transparent, but also discoverable, so that people will be like, oh, there is this thing here that's already been worked on that we can build on top of. And I think that to me is what, really has had the impact of working in open. Is not just, oh, this is something that's being worked on, like the way Steph maybe came out, but more that just general things are being built upon what has worked on. We've already worked on, so people don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. And I think that's actually one of the impacts I've seen, particularly with transfer, like tech transfer coming out of academic institutions.
So when you think about open source collaborations, right? Obviously, innovation is a very important component that comes out of all of this work. And I know when you introduce open source practices in an organization, it can change the way people frame or look at certain aspects. And so I'm wondering, as you guys have developed your open source practices, how has it influenced or impacted innovation within your institutions or organizations? What have you seen as a result? Maybe you have a story.
There's actually another panel later today about, open source and innovation.
So I'm getting ahead of myself, am I?
Yeah, exactly. But that's cool. So let's, at the danger of saying that again later, but so one example is in this software-defined vehicle space where, there's this project called S-Core. We develop a software stack together with all these other players. And a big part in the automotive, a big thing in the automotive industry is standards. And obviously you would know in telecommunication as well. So the way this is traditionally done, so we wanted to change a standard or create a standard for something, we would go to our supplier and say, hey, we need this standard changed and do something there. Then, we talk to the supplier for about a year. And then we would go to the standards organization, like Sense and like one of these. And then that would take another year. And then after 2 years, the standard was there and we could start implementing it. Okay.
Very quick.
Very quick. And now in this memorandum of understanding that I mentioned, and also in the in this project, it is the explicit idea: code first. You write the code, make something, create something that works and does something, and then you talk about the standards. So now, we write code together, and the standards organization is at the table, and when something is working, they look at it and say, that's good, we'll turn that into a standard. And the code is done, and then the standard comes out of it. And that really is a total game changer, and it quickens up the pace a lot.
Very nice collaborative effort.
Yep.
Maybe I'll give an example in the AI space. So the Linux Foundation recently launched the Agentic AI Foundation, and Anthropic contributed NCP to that foundation. That's kind of a huge thing in the AI space. Again, just as a level set, MCP is basically how these AI systems are going to talk to each other. So keeping that standard open and many companies having influence on that standard, it'll be a good thing. We joined that foundation as a gold member because it's become very clear to us that this is a technology that we want to understand, we want to influence. And a bit like Wolfgang said, there are standards, and standards are evolving in parallel to this. But here you have open source effectively setting the standard. And the question is, how fast can the standards keep up with the open source? And as the open source evolves, will the standards be able to keep in tune with that? And do the standards understand that? And we have to kind of sit in both worlds, a bit like what you're saying. We have to work with the standards and bring that along, and then we have to work in the open source. But interestingly, Phil, my boss, is here, and the problem landed on his desk as to what we need to do. It was the CTO of Ericsson asked, how do we go and approach this? And the decision was made to actually put an open source person into the MCP Foundation. So a person who has huge experience in open source and navigating open source, has a reputation in open source, is an open source engineer, a developer. It becomes their responsibility to help guide Ericsson within that foundation. And that is a change for us, because traditionally it probably would have been a person who's more involved in traditional standards. And with that, we're reflecting the speed of innovation that's going to happen in the space, and we're tailoring our actions to make sure we can cope with that and also deal with standards that evolve in our own space as well.
Well, we have, like I was saying, that academic open source spaces are really useful for kind of discussions of standardization. We have a few examples of how we've been able to promote some standardization discussions within the storage sector, having the Ceph background. But I also think one thing that we have that a lot of, this is at least a challenge that I am taking on, and I think would be really useful for innovation within the academic open source space or academic research space working in open source, is creating more connections between open source communities and academic open source, and I think that that's still been a friction space. So one of the things that I've really looked for is how to bring my open source folks into open source communities that align with their research, because I think that that's been a friction point, or at least a barrier, where academics aren't gaining from the existing open source ecosystems that are out there, and vice versa. And when I'm thinking about innovation, I think that that's where especially work that's being done maybe by students that's really useful and could be maybe upstreamed into a project, but they don't think to do that because they don't know they could. Where a project that maybe they're working on, it doesn't have to be a standalone thing, but can be part of a larger ecosystem, and thus have be something that builds upon something somebody else is doing, or vice versa, where somebody's building upon what they're doing, and then pushing innovation along, pushing momentum along on the development of particular technologies. And that's just something that I feel that is still there's still a lot of barriers on. It's a part of it's just education and having academics and open source know that they can work together, and just getting the word out, and how integrating kind of different ways of thinking and different workflows. And I think that that's one of the barriers that we're trying to kind of work on as well, and really focusing on pointing out that if the innovative activity will be on both ends of that spectrum, like the academics and the open source, will benefit greatly if you can actually kind of combine those efforts.
And just if I may add something, I mean, just the power of many that's just the thing, so I think we have some very, very smart people at Mercedes, and, same obviously goes for university and for Ericsson, but, to have the ideas and knowledge of other smart people from other companies, that's just, it's just amazing. It's like, so when you contribute to open source, you go kind of through an internal training program. And I have spoken to our developers who said, and it's, I say that, but they experience it, and they say it's actually true, so I created a pull request in his open source project, and then there was an exchange with a maintainer from the project, and he's like, oh, maybe you change a little bit here, let's try something this, and it went back and forth a few times, and then, they learned so much, and he said, it's really true. So that also obviously drives innovation, because you get new ideas from outside of your a space that before, you were just working together with, 20, 50, 100 people. Now you're working with a few thousand, or like that. It's super cool.
I just want to point out that on the academic side of that, when that happens for a student, I mean, the huge impact that can have on a student's career. If you're coming at that from a student perspective, and all of a sudden they start working in an open source community, so that's not quite the innovation maybe we're thinking about. The workforce development innovation aspect of that, I think, is pretty exciting too. And that's what we like seeing our students do, working on an open source project, and then getting mentorship from that project, not just from us, to kind of move forward in that particular sector, is really exciting thing to see.
There's like a network effect that is just very powerful in open source and the collaboration from a startup perspective. So within our discipline, we feel that there are too few people who are necessarily informed or thinking about our workspace. And so there's a lot of people who work in different disciplines who would be able to add valuable insight about their experiences or their concerns. And we can't possibly create all the technology in the world. We want to find people who are looking to iterate on this and work on this and solve the same problem that we see, and illuminate that in a broad context across the globe. So it's just a very powerful opportunity to get a lot of minds together to solve a problem. Thinking about how to collaborate, right? getting people together can sometimes be difficult. Sometimes, I'm sure none of you have experienced that, but collaboration is obviously critical to kind of advancing things. And so I think it would be nice to share some tips that you've learned along the way that have made a positive impact on how you guys are executing today, or things that you would like to do in the future.
Okay. I think one of the things to do, maybe first internally, you got to manage expectations, because collaboration doesn't solve every problem. Open source doesn't solve every problem. Shock horror. And if you want to work in the open, you need to understand what you want to get out of it. And a lot of times groups are misinformed about what the outcomes could be. And they're disappointed, they're burned, and they never want to do it again. And a little bit of what we do is kind of try to make sure that doesn't happen. So like an example, somebody creates something within Ericsson, it's a really cool piece of technology, they think it's cool, and they go, okay, let's open source it. We want to open source it. And they contact us, and we're there, that's great, okay. But they don't really want to put the time into building a community or supporting a community. And you're going, well, who's going to work with you if you're not going to actually be collaborative, you know? And unfortunately that, you know, you have to actually have that dialogue sometimes. And people also, sometimes they make the mistake of having something completely baked and then they put it out there, or they intend to put it out there. And collaborative development is not, I go and take your thing. That's reuse. Collaborative development is, we develop together. So it means, yes, you can start to bake the cake, but you got to allow other people to put some ingredients in, and you got to have a mechanism, and you've got to be receptive to that. And if you're not, forget about open source, because it's not going to work for you, because you will annoy people. People will turn away from you. So managing expectations, making sure, and you know, where things have worked well for us is where you try to solve a common problem. So as I said, give the example of security. Security is a problem that lots of companies have to deal with. One of the initiatives we're working on at the moment is an initiative in the Open Source Security Foundation to see, you know, especially with regulation coming, more and more companies are going to need fixes in the upstream. They're going to need things patched. And what's going to happen is all of these companies are going to come piling in on a few maintainers saying, when are you going to have that fixed? What are you going to do for me? You know, treating them essentially as if they're some sort of paid supplier when they're not. We want to prevent that. We want to see, can companies work more in a loosely coordinated. Obviously, companies do not want to work in a very, you know, you're doing this and you must do this, and it just doesn't work. It's very hard to get that. But at least in a loosely coordinated, hey, we're looking at this, you're looking at this, and foundations help that. So those would be the kind of tips. I think it's primarily around managing the expectations, understanding what collaborative development really means, and that was one of my messages today. Like, you got to really understand it to get the most out of it. Otherwise, you will kind of fall into these kind of problems and anti-patterns. And I don't want to put anyone off of, you know, but let's be realistic too. Like, the problems happen. And, you know, especially in a company like ours where, you know, as I said, we have 150 years of doing things our own way. You want those situations to work out. So we try to make sure that the things that people want to do are business aligned, that they have a realistic expectation of what the community can do, and they're doing things within the kind of normal protocols and conventions of how you collaborate with others.
I agree with, even from an academic perspective, a lot of what you said resonates too, but also, and I think even more, the setting of expectations on both sides is important, because academics have a different timeline and a different flow than the industry. And so understanding that is one thing. The idea of like, oh, I'm just going to create this open source project and somebody's going to take it over is something that, yes, we see. And we have to kind of get a little bit of education and understanding that there's maybe a few more steps that you need to take if you really want your technology or whatever you've been working on to resonate outside of your small lab. I mean, I'm working on with a group right now where I was having them interview like people from Linux Foundation to give them idea of how structure works, just not because, and the lead was like, oh, so we can be part of the Linux Foundation. And I was like, no, that's not what I meant. There are so many more steps for you to get to before you get to that point. And that kind of understanding of the expectations of both sides, I think is super important. But also, recognizing that this shouldn't be a one-directional thing. So a lot of times there's a concern in academic, particularly with TTOs, that for tech transfer offices that, oh, they're just trying to get RIP for free, or they don't want to have to deal with licensing issues, and so recognizing that is a concern, and that what you want to do is make sure you're very transparent about what the researchers are benefiting from, how the impact is being made from like from the industry side, that it's not just one specific company benefiting from it. It's actually a sector-wide thing. And also understanding that understanding the educational components, the fact that you might be able to also leverage these activities to help students, which is a huge sell and from the academic side, to be able to say this is workforce development. So you're not having students speak cheap labor. It's more they're learning real skills for them when they're getting out of university. And I think that all of those things are things to consider when you're looking at a potential collaboration. And also things to avoid are things like, getting locked into working with one company without having those kind of understanding of the broader impact that you might have if you would make it more general, make it more of a wider discussion, like in the standards discussion or something like that. So
tips of collaboration.
Okay, so maybe one. So we want our engineers to contribute to upstream projects. Well, for one, because they learn, as I just mentioned. For two, because you don't want to be a freeloader only, you want to also give back. And three, because it actually, to invest the time to make an upstream contribution will be less costly for you as a company than to maintain a fork internally and rebase it all the time, okay? So we encourage our engineers, hey, please contribute upstream. And they do that, but at the same time, they told us, yeah, but it's actually a bit painful because you have to take care of all these things. We have rules and guidelines, make it safe and secure, and the license and all of this. And so we have understood that, and we're right now in the process of making contributions easier. If it's just a small bug fix, just do it. Okay. And if it's a big thing, okay, maybe consider here, do the training, whatever, but so messages, make it as painless and frictionless as possible for your engineers to contribute up to upstream projects.
Fantastic. I think that is time. I want to give a big round of applause to the panel, and they will be here for you to ask questions later, so find them.